Felipe did his PhD here in seeds at UQ and has done various sort of postdoc things since then. Felipe has a strong interest in, I suppose, landscape ecology in human-dominated environments, but really has very broad interests across lots of issues around ecosystem services, around social ecological systems and biodiversity conservation. And he's created a number of really fascinating, exciting projects over the years. So Felipe, it's a great pleasure to have you speaking with us today. So thank you very much, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, it's great to finally give a talk here at CBCS. As Richard said, I've been here a number of years. This is my 7th year at UQ. And I'm very excited to show you some of the main results of some of the projects that I've been working on here. I want to first thank to many of the institutions that have helped me during the last few years, the Colombian government, the University of Queensland and the Center of CBCS, Humboldt Institute, an institute from Colombia where I've been working during the last year, and many of the results that I'll be presenting today. The projects have been possible thanks to the support of the Australian government as well, both for my some personal help and also then for the project funding. So today I'm going to talk about managing the landscape structure and for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the first part of the talk, I'll be mostly trying to get some general and very quick overview of what are the main concepts that are important to understand this issue. I apologize if many of you are familiar with these topics, but I think it's important that we are all on the same page on what do we mean by landscape structure, what do we mean by fragmentation, and all these different concepts that are related to landscape structure in areas that aren't under a high pressure by human activities. So as we know, there are a few like fragmented landscapes are becoming more and more common around the world, both in rural areas, in urban areas, but also protected areas have become more and more disconnected. And this is an issue that affects ecosystems at multiple scales. So we know that we are very interested in knowing how we can protect remnant patches of native vegetation that are immersed in a matrix of human-dominated land cover types. And there are many different management actions that people are looking at multiple spatial scales all the time to try to increase connectivity among all of these different patches. And there are also other problems related to how species are affected within a patch in terms of how there is interaction between matrix and the patch and the multiple edge effects that affect the species in different ways and that are related to their species traits as well, and some aspects of their ecology. And with this, what I'm saying is that this is a big problem or a big field of research that has many decades of studies, and that we already know a lot about how landscape structure could be affecting many different processes for multiple species and for different ecosystems. But what I'm going to try to show you during this talk is that not necessarily because we think on fragmentation or because we think about changes in landscape structure and reduction in these habitat loss, that means that everything is bad for biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is a very complex issue, and what we really need to think about is what are the main processes that are interested in when we are talking about the effects of landscape structure on biodiversity. So what do we mean by landscape structure? So landscape structure, basically, you have, when you're analyzing a landscape, you can get different land cover types. Let's do it in the most simplistic way. You can have 4 different land cover types, or in this case, only 2 land cover types. And if you only take into consideration the proportion of those different land cover types, or imagine that you're also talking about habitat types or other kind of classifications of categories that you can give to landscape elements. If you only talk about the proportion of those land cover types, then you would think in landscape composition, right? How much forest do you have left in one particular area? What is the proportion of urban areas or agricultural lands in one specific landscape? But then if you start thinking about the spatial configuration, the arrangement of all these different land cover types within your landscape, then you start thinking about configuration. What are the spatial relationships between the different land cover types here? And you can get very complex relationships, very interdispersed association between all different land cover types, or you can have very simplistic associations here with one land cover type is aggregated in one part and the other type is here. So depending on what is this relationship between configuration and composition, you can have different effects on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And as I was saying, we already know that this is important. Configuration is important. I'm not, even though there is a huge debate on what are if the effects of fragmentation, that is one of the processes that is related to landscape configuration. Those are not the same thing, but let's see that fragmentation is the process of breaking apart the habitat. When you think about that, we already know that in some areas, more fragmented landscapes tend to have negative effect on multiple species because the area that the amount of reachable habitat, when you have only this percentage here is the amount of remaining habitat in the landscape. When you have just a very little amount of habitat and you have high fragmentation, then you can basically, the amount of reachable habitat is low. But because here you have some, like in this case, you have more habitat. If you compare here, then the amount of reachable habitat could be much higher. That could have positive and negative implications depending on what is the process that you're analyzing. But in general, people tend to link this to negative effects. And again, for example, if you analyze the species area relationships and extinctions caused by habitat loss and fragmentation, and there is theoretical and empirical evidence that show you that when you have more fragments for a reduced amount of remaining habitat, if you say this here is, imagine that 1 is that all the landscape is covered by habitat, but 0.3 is just that 30% of the habitat is remaining in that landscape. If you analyze multiple landscapes with the same amount of habitat, but with different configurations, you'll find that the more fragments you have, the lower is the number of remaining species. And this is from theoretical and empirical evidence. There is a lot of studies that have shown this. But there is this debate of, okay, the responses can't be all like negative or positive, negative. Like that would depend on which type of landscape you're analyzing. And some authors like Leonard Farrig is one of the most renowned researchers in terms of the field of landscape ecology and the study of fragmentation. In a recent review, this is from 2017, she showed that most of the studies that she analyzed that were at the same, that have the same conditions, that were analyzing only fragmentation effects, most of those effects were positive on biodiversity. And she even said that she didn't find any conditions in which most responses were negative. So in some areas, some of the studies, she also found out, those studies also found some positive, like responses if they were analyzing another process within the same study. So there is this big debate of is it fragmentation good or bad for biodiversity? What are the implications of this for biodiversity conservation? And of course, there's been a lot of criticisms to this paper and a lot of rebuttals, but the point is that this problem is not that easy. It's not like fragmentation bad for biodiversity. Let's try to aggregate everything so we can maximize different components of biodiversity. That's not how it works. And to add more complexity to this topic is that biodiversity is not just counting species. We are not only interested in maximizing species richness, we're also interested in maximizing other components of biodiversity, like for example, the diversity of species traits that are related to particular functions within a particular system. So another relevant question here is, how do we measure biodiversity that is relevant for ecosystem services? All the services that we can get from the ecosystems that are provided by nature. So we know that changes in the species diversity could affect ecosystem functions, and that has an effect on ecosystem services. But the relationship between the species diversity and ecosystem function, it could take many different shapes. So this is not a linear relationship. No fragmentation, not necessarily, species diversity is not necessarily, ecosystem function doesn't necessarily increase linearly with species diversity. And there is a lot of evidence on that as well. There are studies from the 70s showing this, that this relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem function is not linear. So that means that when we start looking at all the different studies and we start looking at, okay, are we interested in taxonomic or phylogenetic functional diversity, we know that this relationship between diversity gradient is very different depending on the area that you're analyzing. So for example, here, in this study, for example, they were looking at the number of protected areas, the windows that included protected areas, the percentage of the area that was protected. And you can see how initially, when the percentage is relatively at this percentage here, when it's high, you can see that you have a high taxonomic diversity, but that's not necessarily translated to other components of diversity, both for gamma diversity and beta diversity. So this is a complex issue. Like, even though we know that the relationship is very different, the main question is, how can we measure that diversity and how can we relate it to landscape change at the scales that are important for management and for conservation. And this is one of the first projects that I was involved when I was at UQ, and this was led by Matthew Mitchell. That possibly many of you met here while he was doing his postdoc with Jonathan Rhodes and Martin Maron. And basically in this particular paper, we developed a framework that is showing how spatial configuration of different supply areas, the areas that are supplying ecosystem services, will affect differently ecosystem services. So if you look at this, the green squares here represent the areas of supply, the red areas represent the areas of the ecosystem service provisioning, and the arrows represent the ecosystem service flow. And what you would see here is that depending on how is the spatial configuration of these different supply areas, the level of provisioning will change across the whole landscape. In this case, for example, having these small patches distributed in a larger extent within your landscape will increase provisioning in general across the whole landscape. But there are increase interspersion, for example, here it's important, but then when you have isolation, maybe the flows won't be as good between the different areas. edge effects will have other effects or reduced patch size. You will expect that areas with smaller patch sizes will have smaller ecosystem service provisioning. So if you think about the ecosystem services as well, you would know that, and you try to link it with landscape structure, depending on the type of service that you analyze, the effects of landscape structure will be different as well. So, for example, pollination generally could be affected by high levels of fragmentation and isolation because bees or pollinators can't reach the demand areas because they are too far from the supply area. So that's a clear negative effect. But at large scales, for example, carbon sequestration won't be that affected by how is the spatial distribution of the patches, because what you really would need is to have enough patches of native vegetation to capture carbon, although at local scales that would depend on how you're analyzing that at the edge, because at the edge in many cases you will have less capture of carbon. And then, for example, for some cultural recreation services, having a high level of fragmentation sometimes could be good, or even no fragmentation, but a good level of interspersion between the demand and the supply areas would be good, because people will have more opportunities to interact with nature. It would be easier for people to get into the different native areas and walk through them and interact more strongly than if you have a very large patch where that is kind of inaccessible to many people. So with this first part of the talk, what I wanted to highlight is that landscape structure matters. The problem is to know how and when. We know that landscape configuration is important, but that's not always the case in many. And I will show some examples about that later. And the second thing is that responses of biodiversity to changes in landscape structure depend on the metric evaluated. So are we focusing on maximizing species richness? Are we focusing on maximizing the diversity of traits within an assemblage? That's like functional diversity, or are we focused on ecosystem services per se? And one thing that I will show here now is that we can predict things with one of the things that I was very interested in my PhD was to see how can we predict species responses to landscape change depending on their species traits. And there is a lot of studies showing that some particular traits are important in how species respond to fragmentation, but the way that the species respond and the level of importance of those traits explaining the species responses depends a lot on the region and on the spatial scale of interest. And I wanted to see if there is a way that you can understand how you can predict, depending on the distribution of species traits within a community, if the effects of fragmentation would be larger or smaller on functional diversity. And to explain that better, just imagine that you have this group of species. We know that there will be more species with a large gape width, and larger species will tend to be more affected when the area of the patches decreases. So this species, for example, only appears in areas that have large patches and that are relatively unfragmented. And then you have, when you're analyzing communities, you know that not all the species have the same abundance, right? And you can have a distribution, and this is a very theoretical way to show it. But imagine that you have these two types of communities. So you already know that some species would respond differently. You would expect that some species will respond differently to landscape change. How about it now we quantify the distribution of that trait across a particular community and then try to understand if fragmentation and habitat loss will have a high effect on the whole assemblage per se. So imagine that you have these two types of communities. This one here has a more diverse distribution of trait values, you have more species. This is exaggerating, but it's just to get the point that here you get more species that are towards the extreme of the distribution of the trait values. And then here you have a more homogeneous community where most of the species are towards the mean of the distribution of trait values. So this red community here would have a high variance in the distribution of traits, and this one here will have a low variance in the distribution of traits. Yeah. And what happened if we did a simulation study where we are trying to analyze what would happen when to the relationship between the number of species that you have in a particular landscape and the richness of the traits that you will have in that landscape when you start fragmented those landscapes. So I'm not going to explain here the spatial model that we used. That's I am happy to talk about later, but it was basically a meta-community model where we simulated multiple landscapes with different, each of these points is a landscape with a different level of fragmentation and a different level of habitat loss. And you will see here that species richness is very correlated to habitat loss in this case. So imagine that you have here, these landscapes here are the ones that have the highest habitat loss. And then you are comparing fragmented, the orange line here, with the non-fragmented one, that is the green one. And what you would see here is that depending on the type of community that you're analyzing, those that have a high variance in the distribution of traits, you will get clearer effects of fragmentation for the same number of species compared to species, to assemblages where there is a low variance in the distribution of traits. So in a way, there is it is possible to try to predict what would happen to a particular community if we start analyzing what would be the distribution of traits. What would happen if we start fragmenting a landscape? That would be like the main message here. And if we move to a particular case study where we would like to know, okay, we know that it's possible to identify, depending on the assemblage that we analyze, the effects of fragmentation. What would happen if we want to analyze effects of landscape structure more in general, and if we use real data? So here we know that for urban areas, for example, it's very important if we analyze, like, if there is in urban areas, there is a potential of controlling the spatial arrangement of habitat to maximize the provisioning of functions or biodiversity in general. So we know that there is this debate of the land sharing, land sparing, for example, that what is better to have more aggregated patches in one particular area, or just spread out smaller patches across a large extent and see how that could affect biodiversity, and what would be better if we are, for example, expanding cities. And we wanted to look at that we wanted to look at that in Brisbane. So basically what we did was to look at multiple landscapes with similar amount of tree cover, different landscape configurations. And then imagine these two. What we tried to do was to look at landscapes that would have the same amount of habitat in terms of the tree cover, but different landscape configurations. And that was relatively easy to find in some areas, and not that easy to find in others. But just imagine that all these red areas are the ones that have like low amount of tree covers, but in each of these squares here, you would find like different aggregations like of the tree cover. So that allows us to analyze what would happen to disentangle the effects of fragmentation versus the effect of amount of tree cover and the percentage of built infrastructure. So By using these structural equation models, what we did was to analyze different components of functional diversity. And what you could see here is the blue lines here represent negative effects, and the yellow ones represent positive effects. So of course, built infrastructure increases fragmentation. It has a direct negative effect on the species richness. And because these two components for this ensemble, that it's of insectivorous birds, they are correlated, then you will see like how you will have a very negative effect on the species richness that could be translated on losses of functional richness as well. But interestingly, because of the models that we use, we were able to disentangle other effects that are independent, well, quotation marks, like independent between fragmentation and species richness and fragmentation and functional richness. So there are some direct effects here that are negative on these two components of functional diversity that are not necessarily related to changes in habitat that are associated to build infrastructure. And then when you analyze other ensembles, the important thing here is that when you, for example, focus on nectarivorous and frugivorous birds, we didn't find any effects of fragmentation for that particular group. And even though the species richness and functional richness were also correlated, and there were some negative effects of built infrastructure, for this particular group, fragmentation is not important, explaining just the different types of traits that you could find, not the distribution in terms of abundances or anything else, just what is the range of trait values, basically. That's what you could find, and you could define functional richness here. And basically what we did as well was trying to analyze all the components of functional diversity. In this one here, we're analyzing, is it possible to find like what would happen when you're analyzing species with extreme trait values? So the lower the values here, it means that you are losing species with extreme trait values, or that the abundance of those species is very low. And again, fragmentation, negative effects on species richness, but no effects on that. So what it's really driving this is the amount of tree cover and how much native vegetation is left for this particular group. So doing this and analyzing it, you can like just try to see the differences. I don't want you to look at all the numbers here, but you could see like the different patterns here and how different is the relationship between these components of landscape structure and different components of biodiversity, depending on the group that you're evaluating. And with this, you can see that what is important as well is that we need to understand that this depends on the scale of analysis that we're we're interested in. So here I was only showing you this for landscapes that were analyzed at 1 kilometer square. But we know that depending on the extent that you're analyzing, there are different traits that could be affecting species. And for example, here you can see that it's very important that some small species, this here you see like when you have low amount of tree cover, you will have like a larger amount of species with large sizes. Yeah, and that's something that happens in Brisbane, like large species tend to overcome small species here. And these two traits are highly correlated, of course, body size and dispersal capacity. And you could see how more fragmented habitats tend to have species that are larger and that are and that have very high dispersal capacity compared to other landscapes that are less fragmented. But if we analyze that at other scales, like if in many cases, if we go to very local scale analysis at 1 hectare, that is where many of the restoration projects are done, and many of the interventions are done within cities. the extent at which interventions are done within cities in terms of conservation projects, you would see that we wouldn't find any difference about explaining those effects of fragmentation. So what I'm trying to show here is that if you only take into consideration like one type of landscape structure here, for example, like this one in cities, like very aggregated landscape, because you already have a very tolerant assemblage, then it's possible that you will be favoring species that are already medium, large size with high dispersals, and that will overcome these small aggregated patches of habitat. But if you're able to, the same thing would happen if you only focus on very small patches that are interspersed across the whole city. But so that means that, but when you get these two type of patches that allow connectivity between the relatively large patches and other areas, and increase connectivity and make the matrix and increase matrix permeability, is it possible that you have like a more diverse assemblage of bird species in terms of their traits? So the main thing here is that local actions that are aimed at decreasing the species diversity, but that do not consider the landscape structure effects, may favor species that are already adaptable to urban landscapes and decrease the potential of communities to provide multiple functions. And I'm going to finish with another example here that it's something that I've been really working in a completely different region during the last year. This is work that I've been doing for the Humboldt Institute in Colombia. And what we've been trying to do is studying a systematic approach to set spatially explicit complementary conservation areas in Colombia that are based on connectivity. And this is the whole framework, but what is important here is the areas that I highlighted, that we are creating a spatially explicit conservation targets based on the species distribution models and how much area has been protected per ecoregion. We are analyzing the connectivity for all these different, for different ecoregions based on a cost, weighted distance, and the human footprint data set that exists only for the country. And we are using our optimization analysis to create spatial prioritization maps. And then when we comparing different objectives, I will show you that in 1 second. And with that, we are measuring connectivity depending on how you increase depending on the objective. What happened when you choose some areas for one particular objective? How does affect connectivity? So we have different maps. This is an ecoregion, for example. We have forest maps. We have a water index for the different ecoregions. This is a cost-weighted distance layer that basically we use to generate corridors between the protected areas. We have maps of species richness that were filtered based on local expert knowledge and also species distribution. These species richness maps are based on species distribution models that have been filtered by experts. And we have also a map of carbon for this area. And what we've been doing is basically comparing different objectives when we plan only for corridors. For example, if we give a lot of priority to these areas that increase connectivity among the different protected areas here, what would happen if we do that? What would be the amount of connectivity, the connectivity between these different protected areas if we set targets of protection? Like, for example, if we protect 17% of this area, or if we protect 30% of this area, what would happen to the connectivity? How that would be increased depending on the corridors here? What would happen if we focus on water? What would happen if we focus on carbon or species richness? And for example, here, for this ecoregion, if we analyze corridors against carbon, well, this is something that you would expect, like corridors will increase connectivity more compared to carbon. We are using the ProdCon measure, that it's one very well-known connectivity measure to analyze structural connectivity among protected areas. And this is the original connectivity, just taking into consideration the green areas here. This is when you add the purple areas, and this is what happens when you add the orange areas. And then again, we do that for, this is in Spanish, sorry, but this is water and this is corridors. Again, corridors for this particular ecoregion are important as well. Increasing connectivity, more important, or they provide a higher benefit compared to water. But what is important here is that that's not always the case for all the ecoregions. So I'm gonna spend 1 minute here. This is the last slide, I think, before the conclusions. Each of these points represent a different ecoregion. An ecoregion that hasn't achieved a target of conservation. In this case, for example, it would be protecting 17% or of that ecoregion. In this case, would be protecting 30% of that ecoregion. Here you find the dispersal distances. So what we are trying to look here is what is the difference in connectivity. So we know we have this value of connectivity for corridors, and we have this value of connectivity for water. Yeah. So what would happen? And if we look at the difference between these two numbers, between the 7 point something here and the 6.8 here, for each of those ecoregions, for one particular scenario, considering multiple dispersal distances. So everything that is positive here, it means that the connectivity of the corridors, when you prioritize for corridors, is higher than the connectivity of the alternative scenario. In this case, I'm showing you the results for biodiversity in terms of species richness. Everything that is negative here, that is below 0, this is 0, sorry, I think it is gone. I lost here the numbers, but this line represents a 0. Everything that is lower than 0 here represents areas where the connectivity, when you plan for corridors, is lower than the connectivity for the alternative scenario. And this is a bit counterintuitive. This is not what you would expect, and we would expect that the corridors will always increase connectivity. But there are some reasons for that, and that depends on the size of the ecoregion and basically as well how expensive it is to preserve some of these areas when you are trying to protect corridors. Sometimes basically our ranking analysis is not selecting some of those areas, even if they increase connectivity, because they are too expensive compared to other areas. So the important point here is that not necessarily because you are trying to increase connectivity a priori, you would get those benefits because there are different synergies and trade-off between the different scenarios across different ecoregions. This is something that we are analyzing. This is what we are trying to understand why this is happening. But I wanted to bring this today, even if we haven't finished with this analysis, because this just shows you how complex is the issue of trying to understand how to protect biodiversity in terms of the spatial configuration of different areas. It's not that easy. It's not just let's increase connectivity, because that wouldn't affect positively all the different components of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I wanted to finish here just showing you like some of the main things of future research. Multiscale frameworks are very important. As I show you, the spatial scale of analysis is very important, but doing this in the field and collecting evidence for, even though many people have done it, I'm not saying that this is something that no one has done, but it's still something that we need to take into consideration so we can compare among different sites and regions. And that's where we're having problems. Another thing here is taking into consideration the spatial autocorrelation of habitat types is not the same fragmenting one area that is mostly forests or fragmenting like areas that are aggregated to some particular area, to some particular sections of the landscape. This is very important as well. We need more empirical support for species trait frameworks. What are the traits that are related to drivers of change and ecosystem functions? This is a big avenue of research, but even though this seems like very general things, but I just wanted to show you here because we're still very behind in terms of getting a comprehensive evidence that allow us to compare among different regions and get a proper vision of what are the main effects of landscape structure at multiple scales on biodiversity. With this, I would like to thank you for listening to this talk, and also these are my main collaborators, especially while I've been here at the UQ, and all these organizations that have helped me during the last few years. So thank you very much, and thank you to the CBCS for hosting me and for also allowing me to do all this research.